Hello, everybody. We're just off an interesting conversation with Edmund Fawcett, the intellectual historian, on the futures of 21st century liberalism and conservatism. Fawcett is the author of two extremely good books: Conservatism, The Fight for Tradition, and Liberalism, The Life of an Idea. He has this wonderful quote. He wrote, were politics chess, liberals had white, they moved first. Conservatives had black. They countered liberalism's opening moves. In time, the initiative changed hands. Conservatives, who began as anti-moderns, came to master modernity. For the right was in telling ways the stronger contestant. He writes this in Conservatism, The Fight for Tradition. I'm not sure all conservatives would necessarily agree. My guest today is one of America's most distinguished and respected, certainly moral conservatives, often described as the conscience of American conservatism, Pete Wehner. He had a wonderful piece last week in the New York Times. What has happened to my party haunts me. Pete is a regular guest, an old friend, and he's joining us from his home in McLean, Virginia. Pete, before we get to the fate of the Republican Party, what do you think of Fawcett's idea of this ongoing chess game between conservatives and liberals, and that whilst the liberals had the first move, it's the conservatives who have most successfully mastered modernity?
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Andrew. Thanks for having me on. It's an interesting analogy. There's something to it, I think, in terms of the nature of conservatism is to conserve. And often, if you see liberalism and conservatism play itself out in history, liberalism makes moves, makes in some cases advancements. Conservatives tend to argue to go slower, not to be radical in the steps that are taken, and to try and respect history and experience and wisdom that informed what came before. And I think that liberalism tends to be ideologically more aggressive than conservatism has historically been. I'm not sure about the latter half of that quote, if I agree with it. I mean, I have to see more of the context. I don't know that
you need to read the book, Pete. I think
actually both of them sound really interesting to me. I'm making a mental note too.
They're excellent intellectual histories. Well, let's talk about what you call your party. What has happened to my party haunts me. That was the title of your recent New York Times piece. You haven't been ashamed to claim the party or associate yourself with the party. It is, of course, the GOP, the grand old party, which has changed dramatically since you were involved with it. Originally, back in the 1980s, you were associated with, you worked for Ronald Reagan and George Bush. What for you is this party that you call my party, the GOP, the grand old party? What does it stand for?
Well, today I would say that it stands for populism rather than conservatism. And I would say beyond that, it's a party that embodies lawlessness and nihilism and an embrace of illiberalism. I think it's.
I think you're jumping ahead a little bit, Pete.
Okay.
What has happened to my party? That's not the party that's yours. That's another party. We'll come to that in a minute.
Yeah.
What was the party? What was the Republican Party that you joined? I think you and I have talked about this last time we actually sat down together physically in Washington, D.C.
Right.
You joined it in the late 70s, 80s. What kind of party was it?
Well, it was a conservative party. It was American conservatism. It was embodied at that time in Ronald Reagan and what Reagan represented about conservatism. It believed in a strong role in world affairs for America, that democracy and human rights should be at the core of foreign policy. It believed in more limited government and more fiscal responsibility. Now, the execution of that was pretty sketchy at times, including under Reagan, but as a principle, that was something that conservatives believed in. It was a socially conservative party as well. So those were the three legs of the stool, which was a popular analogy that was used at that time. And then there was a conservative sensibility that I think marked it. The Republican Party that I was formed by and that drew me into it was pro-immigrant, legal immigrant for one thing. It stood for law and order. Um, and interestingly, there was a very strong element within the Conservative Party, and probably the parts that I was most associated with and associated myself with, of a kind of moral conservatism. So in the late 1980s, for example, professor at University of Chicago, Alan Bloom, wrote a significant book called The Closing of the American Mind, which was basically a lament about the rise of nihilism on university campuses, but within modern society, American society as a whole. And so conservatives stood up against it. So that was a party that I was a part of. It was represented by people like Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, later Mitt Romney, and John McCain. It wasn't a perfect party by any means, and I wasn't drawn to it primarily, I should say, because I was a party man. I was more interested in conservatism and ideas than I was in the instrumentalities of a party. But I felt like the Republican Party was really the home of conservatism.
Some people might be listening to this, Pete, and think, well, he's talking about these three stools. There was, of course, the fourth leg to this stool, which is Richard Nixon, the beginnings of what some people see as the dog whistling ideology of the 1980s, the roots in some ways of Trumpism. When you joined the party, you and I have talked about this before. Were you aware that there was already the beginnings of a struggle for the conscience of your party?
To some extent. I mean, you're right about Nixon, and as I said, it wasn't a perfect party. I mean, Reagan was obviously a break with Nixon, who himself was not particularly conservative ideologically, and he was corrupt. Uh, how aware was I at the time of sort of the dark elements and the uglier aspects of the Republican Party? I knew they existed. I mean, there were fringe elements to the Republican Party, like there are fringe elements really to any large political party in in society, and they were there, and I saw them. Their heads would pop up. It was embodied, I would say, in people like Howard Phillips, Jerry Falwell, and Pat Robertson, um, and a fellow named Mel Bradford, who was an influential figure on Pat Buchanan in the academic world. So those darker elements existed. I didn't think that they were as influential, certainly as they become in the Trump era, and I felt like that the leaders of the Republican Party, including Reagan, for the most part, stood up to them. Not perfectly, but I think well enough. And so, so I felt like they were confined. And I think in the Trump era, they're not. They have the run of the show.
What about men like Buchanan? We did a show with John Gantz, very talented young journalist. He has a new book out, When the Clocks Broke, about the way in which David Duke, to the right of Buchanan, began to try to establish himself as a mainstream Republican.
Right.
Is there any truth to this, Pete, that the Dukes, the David Dukes of the world, who once dressed themselves up in the uniform of the Klan, took these uniforms off and began to try to infiltrate, take over the Republican Party?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you go back in the 90s, David Duke was running for office in Louisiana, and there was actually a debate within the George H.W. Bush White House about whether President Bush should speak out against David Duke. Now, look, Bush's moral impulses was to do it. The question was a pragmatic one, which is, would having the president go out against Duke help him with the base of the Louisiana Republican Party. In the end, George H.W. Bush did speak out against Duke, and I worked with people who urged him to do it, and I think it was the right thing to do. But Duke was a force back then, and Buchanan, I think, is a vastly underestimated force in understanding the Trump phenomenon. I mean, if you go back to Buchanan of 92 and 96 and subsequent to that, he provided, to the extent that MAGA world, Trump world, has an intellectual infrastructure and intellectual coherence, you really find it in Pat Buchanan. One other thing on Buchanan, he's an interesting figure because he was very different in the 90s than he was in the 80s. He worked in the Reagan White House, as you know, in the 1980s, and was a more traditional conservative. But the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union brought back what was referred to as this paleo-conservative movement. Buchanan always had those elements within him. He comes from a certain strand of Catholicism where those elements have traction, but he had set them aside in the Reagan White House. So when Reagan left, a lot of these things that had been tamped down came to the fore, and Buchanan really was a precursor to Trump and Trumpism.
Pete, as I said, you're wonderful. Your stuff's always excellent. In the Atlantic and New York Times, this latest one from last week, "What Has Happened to My Party Haunts Me," from New York Times, is particularly resonant. But people change, parties change. Pete, why can some people might read this and think, well, Pete Wehner is a highly principled man. He used to define himself as a conservative. Today, he's probably closer to being a liberal. He's certainly closer to the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. Why not just change parties? What's so traumatic, Pete, about giving up a party and joining another? Parties are always changing.
I don't think there is a trauma. I mean, the headline is slightly misleading, I'd say, to this extent. I consider the Republican Party my former party,
and I was like a wife, right? My ex-wife.
Yeah, I mean, I voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and I wrote an essay in the Times making the case that conservatives should vote for Joe Biden. I would say I'm operationally, in terms of elections, Democratic now. I did vote for Nikki Haley in the Virginia primary in 2024, both because I could certainly live with Nikki Haley. She was more of a pre-Trump conservative, at least her best self is, and because I wanted to try and stop Trump. But if you ask me, who do I associate today, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? It's more the Democratic Party. And it's not because I'm a liberal or a progressive. It's because I view the Republican Party as a unique threat to American democracy. And again, I think that the Republican Party is not a conservative party anymore. It's populist. So I don't think there's anything traumatic for me to give up the allegiance to the Republican Party, just like it's not particularly traumatic for me to say I no longer associate with evangelical Christianity. The way I put it, Andrew, is that I'm still a conservative, but I'm not a Republican. I'm still a Christian, but I'm not an evangelical. And I think you're right. People change, parties change, moments change, and individuals have to, as best they can, with as good a conscience as they can, as fair-mindedly as they can, try and move with those times, and give allegiance to the truth as you see it in any moment in time. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm sure I fall short of it, but that's where I am.
We did a show a year or two ago, Closing of the American Mind, on what you call the nihilism of the evangelical right, the Christian right in America. You just noted that you remain religious even if you're not an evangelical. Has the evangelical party taken over your ex-party, the Republican Party, or has republicanism taken over the evangelical movement, or sort of somehow incorporated its principles, its spirit, its modus vivendi within it?
Yeah, it's an interesting way to frame it. I mean, I think it's some of both. The white evangelical movement is a core element, maybe the most important part of the Republican base. And anybody who's going to be the leader of the Republican Party has to win over a large portion of that cohort, that group. And Donald Trump did it in 2016, and he's certainly done it since then. But I take your point too. I think that the sensibilities of the American right and even the secular right has infused the evangelical fundamentalist world as well. So I do think that a fusion is going on as a kind of a, I don't know, a dialectic in a certain way, and I think that they feed off of each other, and increasingly I'd say they're indistinguishable from each other. I do think that Donald Trump is alert to what he has to do to keep the evangelical movement, but interestingly, because it's much more of a cult of personality, he has the capacity to do things that no previous Republican in my lifetime could do and keep the allegiance of the evangelical movement. I'll give you one example, which is abortion. Now, that used to be the most important issue for many evangelicals. And to argue that you change the party platform one iota provoked a firestorm of criticism from evangelicals in the base of the Republican Party. No more, the 2024 Republican platform is essentially pro-choice. It's gotten rid of abortion as the pro-life plank from its platform, and hardly anybody said anything about it. So that illustrates for you and for your listeners the degree to which this is, I think, a cult of personality more than it's anything else.
Come to that in a second. We can take a break in a minute, but I want to touch a little bit on your morality or your focus on morality. Another show we did last year, and you wrote some wonderful stuff on this for the Atlantic and New York Times, was on our moral moment, a moral moment where we make our moral choices. Maybe I'm getting this word wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, Pete, but your nostalgia for a Republican Party of the Bushes is a nostalgia for a party that wasn't particularly moral. What is it about the Bushes in particular, who seem extremely pragmatic, almost Machiavellian in their approach to politics, that would make you nostalgic for a pre-Trump, pre-MAGA party?
Yeah, I disaggregate your question a little bit. I don't think I'm quite as nostalgic as you say, and I'd offer one data point to support my case. Now, I was part of a group we were referred to in the pre-Trump era in the mid 2010s as reformicons. Those were individuals like Scott Winthrop and Yuval Levin and Ramesh Ponnuru and others. And we were engaged in an effort to reform the Republican Party because we thought it was too nostalgic, that it was caught in a time warp. As a friend of mine said, for conservatives of that era in the mid 2000s and 2010s, it was like every day they woke up was January 20th, 1981. And we felt like that the Republican Party was caught in the Reagan era, and that the challenges had changed and the times had changed and the policies needed to change. So we were actually arguing for focus on the challenges to the working class and many other things. We produced a document that laid out that agenda. And you know who one of the leaders of that movement was? Marco Rubio, who was a reform-minded politician at that time. Since he's given up all his principles.
I thought you were going to say J.D. Vance. If he'd have been younger, been a bit older, he probably would have been as well.
Yeah, actually, J.D. Vance probably would have been exactly where we were. So I don't think have a nostalgia for that time. And again, I'm perfectly, depending on the facts and circumstances we're talking about, to say that the Republican Party was imperfect. And I don't even, I'm closest to George W. Bush. I understand the point about George H.W. Bush being pragmatic. He wasn't as ideological or as someone who was shaped by the conservative movement as Ronald Reagan. I do think that all three of those individuals were at their core decent and moral people, and I thought that the party itself, for the most part, embodied a worldview that resonated with me and that I thought had a moral element, if not at its center, then try to define it. And it was an imperfect effort to try and get the party to advance moral principles and moral policies. But times change, and so I'm completely fine in saying that things need to be adjusted. So I don't think I'm pining so much for the Republican Party of the 1980s and the 1990s, though there are elements of it philosophically that still resonate with me. I would say that what I would like the Republican Party to get back to in the first instance is to be a party that isn't lawless, that isn't destroying norms, and isn't a threat to liberalism in the classical sense in American democracy. I mean, if we could get back to that, if that qualifies as nostalgia, I'll take it.
I want to take a break, but just one question before the break, Pete. Let's go back to this chess quotation from Fawcett. Conservatives, you say, who began as anti-moderns, began to master modernity. As a modernizer within the Republican Party, you've identified yourself before you left the party. What elements of modernization did you want, or would you like the Republicans to address to win over the electorate that are in contrast with Trump and his populist approach?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say two things. The first is just on that quote. I would say that the Republican Party is postmodern, that's not mastered modernity as much as it's postmodern.
So it's mastered. That's a nice way of putting it. Mastered postmodernity.
Yeah, I think that's where I would dissent.
But perhaps, Pete, given we live in a postmodern age, that's probably the right thing to do, isn't it?
It's not the right thing to do.
But it's what you have to do if you want power, one way or the other.
Yeah. First, I'm not sure you have to do it if you want power. I think there are other ways to get to power without doing it. But even if it's the only path to power, it's not the right way to power. It may be the means to power, but unless you believe in a kind of Nietzschean, Machiavellian world where power is the sum total of what you want, if that's the primus inter pares, then maybe. But that's not how I view politics. It's now not how politics should be understood. But I'll grant you the point, which is obviously Trump has tapped into something. Now, look, we shouldn't portray him as a political behemoth who is unbeatable. He lost the 2020 election. Republicans did poorly in 2018, 2020, 21. He may well lose in 2024 to Kamala Harris now that Joe Biden is off the ticket. So it's not as if he's an unstoppable force or that MAGA is an unstoppable force. Democrats have control of the Senate. It's razor thin in the House. So I'm not convinced that the Trumpian postmodern nihilistic agenda, whatever you want to refer to it, or sensibilities, is the only or even the best way to seize power. But it's certainly taken hold of the Republican Party. I'll grant you that, and that grip is not going to loosen for a long, long time.
We're speaking with Pete Wehner, one of America's most articulate and respected conservatives, no longer involved with the Republican Party, the author of What Has Happened to My Party Haunts Me. Maybe it's a horror film that Hollywood will turn into something that will scare everyone. It's scaring us in real life. I want to remind everyone that wonderful guests like Pete, who's been on the show many times, are brought to us because of our friends at Liberty's excellent new quarterly of culture and politics that address a lot of the issues that Pete's been talking about. I'm going to run a short video feature on Liberty's, and then we'll be back. And I want to talk a little bit more about how to, in Pete's language, master post-modernity in a moral rather than amoral or nihilistic way. So we'll be back in a second. Don't go away, anyone.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with my favorite American conservative, Pete Wehner. Pete, before the break, you revised Edmund Fawcett's quote about the chess game to control the modern age. You thought of it as a chess game to control the postmodern age, but in political terms, between conservatives and liberals. And when you go to Donald Trump's website, there's a kind of postmodern message, I guess, on the front page. He writes, "They're not after me, they're after you. I'm just standing in the way." We did a show last week with a couple of political scientists on a return to kind of patrimonialism in American politics, in global politics. Is that what's happening with Trump? That it's a kind of a weird, and I use that word carefully, a weird postmodern patrimonialism, a personalization of everything?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. Personalization of everything. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, politics has an almost quasi-religious dimension to it these days, which isn't healthy for politics, not healthy for religion and faith either. And maybe we can talk about that later. But and there is this element, as I referred to earlier, as a kind of cult of personality around Trump. He's a genius at this in a certain way. He has a deep intuitive understanding of what plays with his base. He has a capacity to win over people who earlier in his political career were somewhat skeptical about him, and he has portrayed himself almost like a Christ-like figure to a lot of people. That's really what he's getting at. There are a whole series of
postmodern Christ-like figure, though, Pete, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, in terms of Christ-like, in terms of character, temperament, ethics, he's the antithesis of
or a reality television Christ-like figure.
Yeah, for sure, indeed. Since you mentioned that, reality television, I mean, I think one of the issues that I'm most concerned about, one of the topics that is on my mind most in this decade, is the assault on reality and epistemology. And and Trump again is a master at that. The gaslighting, the just avalanche of false information, outrageous information, which is disorienting to people. So on some primal level, he has an understanding of human psychology and has used it very, very well. He certainly has set up to his supporters this idea of, and it's articulated on that website, which is, it's not about me, it's about you. And so every assault on me is an assault on you. And I am your protector. I'm your vengeance. I'm your retribution. So it's a deeply personalized kind of politics. Now, we've seen that kind of politics, in world history. It tends not to end well in those kinds of situations. It's unusual in American politics. It's not unheard of. There are elements of it, and charismatic figures, arise too. I mean, you saw it with Barack Obama and with a lot of other figures in American history. But there's something about Trump that is different, both in the degree of, I would say, the personalization and then the depravity of the man himself.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up charisma. And my talk with Steve Hansen and Jeff Kopstein, who wrote the book about the return of patrimonialism, they refer a lot to the sociology of Max Weber, who talks about three kinds of authority: charismatic, rational, legal, and patrimonial or traditional. And of course, as you suggest, Trump seems to combine all three in a weird way. He seems to manage the legal system or take advantage of it, but he's essentially a historic figure. Pete, what We talked about this assault on you talked about the assault on reality. Your friend Jonathan Rauch, another good friend of mine, been on the show many times, written an excellent book on this.
He sure did.
Undermining of any kind of ontological certainty. In your view, then, is Trump almost, if not an inevitable, certainly an unsurprising consequence of our social media age, of the digital revolution, as John Rauch suggests, I think?
Yeah, I don't think he's inevitable. I mean, history could have taken different turns if a few things have gone differently. He's not a shocking manifestation of that. Both the digital age, but also the age in which we live in, and the incentive structures in politics are such that we've moved from the politics of substance to the politics of theatrics, and there's no more theatrical figure in American politics and virtually on the entire world stage than Trump. But it is this sense, which is rare in a political figure, of the total lack of any moral considerations, and it's so undisguised with Trump. That is unusual. I mean, you can get leaders who are immoral themselves, but often they need to try and use the garb of morality to hide their immorality. Trump is not like that. It's fully on display. It's on what he's done. It's on what he said. So he's advertising in bright neon lights, and yet it continues to have this enormous appeal to the vast majority of Republicans, and that is in part on Trump, but it's also largely in part on the people who are lining up behind him. They can't say that they haven't been told. They can't say that they haven't been warned. And the fact that they can embrace him, having been told and having been warned, is really one of the puzzling political and psychological dimensions of this moment.
Is it really that puzzling, Pete? I mean, the tradition of, if it's a philosophy or an ideology, the ideology of right is might goes back. It certainly goes back to Plato's Republic and Thrasymachus, the idea that power is always justified. It has a long tradition in Western thought. I mean, Machiavelli was enormously influential, although he's a complex figure in that sense. Is it that shocking?
I would say it is shocking in the American tradition.
Even we're in the tradition of Hamilton, for example?
No, I mean, I wouldn't argue that Machiavellism in politics is unprecedented, or the corrupting effects of power, anything like that. I think what's more unusual is someone running proudly on it in this sort of undisguised manner that we're talking about. It's not absolutely unprecedented. I mean, you had Andrew Jackson that had elements of this. Others have had elements of it. But I do think that Trump, in terms of what's definitional to him, I mean, this is not a person who was a great general and had achieved battlefield success. He's not a person who was outstanding governor or senator. He had failed in almost every dimension of his life, other than television and then this theatrical element. He had inherited his wealth, and so he comes to the stage. And what does he offer exactly when he enters a primary in 2016? Is it a compelling agenda? No. You'd listen to him try and articulate his case. It was like a word salad. So what did he have to offer? He had a kind of cruelty. He had a style and a manner of politics that resonated with the majority of his base, and they've come to love him because of it. And that is just unusual. I think that's why Trump himself is an unusual figure. And Yeah. And the other thing I'd say, Andrew, just to pull the lens back even further, think about, for example, the uh, uh, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and then think about all of the um, totalitarian communist societies over the decades, who themselves were brutal and lawless in their use of power, their execution of power, and at their core. And yet, even they had to bow to the principle of democracy and liberty. So their constitutions read very much like ours, like the American Constitution. So in a sense, it was vice having to bow to virtue, or the words of virtue. So there was some acknowledgement that you had to at least present a certain face to the world and to the polity. And Trump, I think, doesn't really do that. Again, he's pretty undisguised in what he's promising and what he's saying, and yet it has enormous resonance. The fact that it has resonance with some people, it's always been true, but the degree to which he has command over, one of the largest and most influential parties in the entire world, that I think is a little unusual.
But that resonance, Pete, is both a product and a reflection of what you call postmodernity, of alienation, of anxiety, of the fragmentation of community. Often one of the critiques of Trump is people say, well, he was never very successful. He took his father's money. He's a failed businessman. He's been bankrupted several times. He's failed as a politician. I wonder whether the electorate is a little bit more sophisticated than perhaps some of the coastal analysts, that Americans see in Trump not victory but failure, and that reflects their own life experience.
That may be true. That may be true. But if that argument leads one to say, well, that Trump is a failure, and therefore I'm going to elect him to lead my country, so my country will fail. I mean, I think it's a pretty strong indictment against him. Look, I mean, I'm not completely unsympathetic to what you say. I've tried to understand the appeal of Trump and the Trump phenomenon.
Yeah, let's be clear. As you know, I'm no great.
Yeah, no. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you raising it. And I have too. I mean, I've had countless conversations, Andrew, with Trump supporters, not primarily to debate them, but to listen to them, to say, help me understand why you are where you are. And I want to understand the links and the chains of their logic. So I've done, I would say, my due diligence on that. And I have to tell you, I'm just not persuaded. I would like to give a more sympathetic portrait to the people who support Donald Trump. I just can't get there. I do understand that he tapped into resentments, grievances, feelings of alienation, the things that you described. That I understand. But he was never able to articulate in word or to execute in deed policies that really helped those people. So their world didn't get better because Donald Trump was there, and there's so much baggage that he brings, so many negative things, and I just think in the end, people have to be responsible. They have to be adults. This is not hard to figure out what he is or who he is or what he wants to do. And people need to be held accountable. It's one of the things that I do in my essays. My critics, I'm sure, think I do it too often, but much of what I do is be very specific in terms of who he is, what he's done. Because in a sense, I want to hold up a mirror to his supporters and to say, if you're going to support him, then you owe it to the rest of us to acknowledge who it is that you're supporting and to acknowledge what he's done. And in my estimation, their willingness to embrace him, given who he is and what he's done, is a really stinging indictment of their politics and of their moral worldview.
Pete, in the essay you write about, and we talked about this before, the patrimonialism as a personal machine as opposed to the traditional political party machinery. Of course, I mentioned J.D. Vance earlier. He's been making a lot of headlines, often rather unfortunate, as the wrong pick. If Trump loses this election to Harris, which seems conceivable, at least, perhaps even likely, does Trumpism have any future in the party? I mean, I'm not sure J.D. Vance has much of a future. If Trump is defeated again in November, will his defeat be a personal one, or is this movement, does it have a future? Is there another Trump, probably not named Trump, in the wings in the party? Maybe even someone worse than Trump?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an unknowable
But what's
question.
your sense, though?
My sense is that the movement will carry on for a long, long time. I mean, there's no question that Trump is unique and his hold on the party is unique. And we've seen other people, even in the 2024 primary, like Ron DeSantis, to try and imitate Trump, even to outflank him in certain ways on culture war issues. And it just didn't work. And J.D. Vance is another example. I mean, he tries to imitate Trump and he doesn't do it very well. So nobody's going to be able to recreate that Trump magic with quote marks around it like him. That said, the party is so fundamentally different. Part of it is just the demographic composition of the party. It's a different party playing to different interests than it was 20, 30 years ago, even 10 years, 15 years ago. So that's one thing that's different. The other thing is that an awful lot of responsible Republicans are leaving the party. So a lot of the radicals, extremists, and crazies are there. I mean, Liz Cheney's left the party. Mitt Romney has left the party. Bob Corker has left the party. You can go down a whole list of people, Chris Christie, and others. So, you know, it's not just that Trump has a personal grip on the party, but this is a thoroughly magnified party, and it will be for a long, long time. You have an entire right-wing ecosystem that is now bought into it and repeating this stuff. So, look, I think for a generation, at least, well, a generation, I'll say that the Republican Party is going to be a magnified party, and I don't think it turns around if Trump loses. I do think that if he loses, the chances for it to turn around sooner or more significantly increase than if he wins, because then Trump is a two-time loser of a presidential campaign, and then there are those midterm elections that I was referring to earlier. Will the party get to the point where they say, you know, this just hadn't worked for us? We tried it. We drew an inside straight in 2016, and he won, and it was fun. But since then, we're just getting beaten. We're getting drubbed. So we want to get rid of it. I don't know. And there's a good chance that the Republicans keep the Senate. So I think that Trump's imprint on the party is going to be lasting at least around for a long, long time.
Final question, Pete. I've been very generous with your time. You're a never Trumper, perhaps the most never of never Trumpers. You've left the party now. Conservatives are divided on the future. Andrew Sullivan, who's not associated, Anglo-American academic, broadcaster, very popular writer, controversial. He's always been a big critic of Donald Trump, like yourself. He wrote an interesting piece recently about the upcoming election, describing it as an agonizing moment of truth. And he acknowledges that he wouldn't actually be certain that he'd vote for Harris. I'm not sure he'd say he'd vote for Trump. He sees Harris as equally problematic in very different ways from Trump. A couple of questions on Harris. What's your sense about her and what's happened over the last couple of weeks? And secondly, do you share Sullivan's concerns about Harris?
Yeah, I'll take those in order. What's happened to her? I think she's had two of the best weeks that any presidential candidate has had in my memory. It's been striking to see how well she's done, and the deficit that she inherited because of Joe Biden has been basically washed away within a matter of a week, 10 days. So she's now, even with Trump, not just in the national polls, but also in these 7 swing states. So I'd say she's probably the marginal favorite at this point. And for her to have done that in such a short period of time has been pretty stunning, because she wasn't known as a fantastic Obama-like, or Clinton-like campaigner. So that's in the short term. I think she's been very sure-footed and has made all the right moves, and is clearly formidable at this point. What do I make of her more generally? She's a person from the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, a different generation, obviously, than Joe Biden. And she didn't do particularly well in the 2020 campaign. I think she's talented. I think she's shown her talents. I think she has some weaknesses too, and she's shown those as well. But so far, she's done a nice job presenting her strengths and guarding against her weaknesses. In terms of Andrew and the piece that he wrote, I mean, Andrew is an intelligent guy, and I like reading him, and I like Andrew personally. I'm not agonized like he is. I think Andrew tends to have a slightly agonized personality, and he can sometimes.
Politely, right?
Yeah, I think he can. I think he can get spun up pretty easily temperamentally. It's interesting, Michael Oakeshott is an intellectual, enormously influential intellectual figure for Andrew, but I'm not sure that Andrew himself has an Oakeshott-like personality or sensibility. In any event, look, I will credit Andrew in the sense that I think he's an independent individual, and I appreciate him for that fact. I disagree with his analysis for a couple of reasons. One is when he says that the assault, that Kamala Harris represents a movement as perfectly as he seems to think that she does, and that movement is as radical an assault on American liberalism as the right, I just think is wrong. I think that's way off base. I also had the feeling that in the case that he made, it sounded a little bit, Andrew, like a lawyer's brief to me. Just that he decided to get everything that he could, every quote that Harris has made, to portray her in the most negative, progressive light. It's not as if he doesn't have material to work with, but look, Harris has already detached herself from her views on fracking and defund the police. I think what happened, my suspicion is she's a person who's more comfortable on the left. I don't think she's hard progressive. I think she has the ability to adjust like most politicians do. She's already done it. I think in 2020, she was running for the progressive vote, and she said things that don't have a lot of resonance with a lot of Americans, and she's walking away from those things in this campaign. I think she's wise to do so. I did an essay in the Atlantic in 2019 on the increasing radicalization of the Democratic Party, and I listed about 10 things that concerned me. And I went back not long ago to see where was Joe Biden on those concerns, and he advanced almost none of them. I suspect if Kamala Harris becomes president, and you read that essay that Andrew wrote that he put on a Substack, 2, 3, 4 years from now, I don't think she is going to be noted for or put much energy at all in the things that Andrew mentions. In the end, it's not that hard for me. I think, look, Donald Trump attempted to overthrow an election, and he encouraged a mob to hang his vice president and inspired that mob to violently attack the Capitol. Now, I could name 15 other things that are really, really problematic about Donald Trump. Kamala Harris is going to be president or Donald Trump is going to be. And I think Kamala Harris, for all of her negatives from my perspective, is a person who's more conservative, obviously, than she is. She's within the 35, 40-yard lines of American politics. Donald Trump is not. And I'll say one other thing that I think is important, Andrew, and I started my essay in the Times on this point, which is if you are a conservative, as Andrew in some respects is, then you really have to want Donald Trump to be defeated, because I said in 2016 that Trump could do to the Republican Party what Hillary Clinton couldn't do, or any Democrat could do, which is to change the party fundamentally from the inside, from a conservative party to a populist party. If Andrew wants conservatism as he understands it to find a home in American politics, it's going to have to be the Republican Party, and that cannot be the party of Donald Trump, which is why he has to be defeated. So if he wants to salvage the best of conservatism, then Donald Trump has to be defeated, and the Republican Party has to find its way into the future in a way that's in many ways fundamentally different than Trump.
Well, we shall see this future. It isn't modernity, it's postmodernity. You've suggested that Trump is the dark side of postmodernity. I suspect that if Harris wins the election, she'll be, in her own way, a postmodern kind of president. I think that's something that Sullivan fears. But Pete, as always, it's a real honor to have you on the show. We'll have to get you back. This is only the beginning of this story. It's not going away.
Right.
And it's so wonderful to always talk to you. You're always very generous with your time and your ideas. And best of luck and keep safe. And we'll talk to you before the election.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll be in touch.